Hi guys. Um, I thought I'd read you guys a story tonight. Won't you travel back into the 1930s with me? This is a long story, but if you want to bear with me and read it. It's a week in the life of a housewife and mother in the 1930s. So let's travel back in time and see what it was like to be a housewife and mother in the 1930s. Maggie Bender came to work for George Johnson and his mother when she was a young girl. George and Maggie were married October 19, 1910, and they continued living on the home place. They had 4 daughters: Margaret, born in 1912, Sarita, 1913, Georgina, 1915, and the spoiled baby of the family, Alice, born in 1923. The old house was torn down and another was built on that property sometime after 1923. It was as it stands today, except for an enclosed porch, right on the beautiful Street Clare River. This is the story of my children, to let them know that life is not always as easy as it is today. Monday is Mother's Day, was wash day. A large oval wash boiler was put on top of a wood-burning stove. The stove had lids that were lifted. When the wood was put in to cook and heat water, in a reservoir on the side the water was kept hot for dishes and Saturday night baths, too. Inside the boiler, filled with water, went 2 squares of bluing, guaranteeing a really blinding white wash. White clothes were boiled until such time to wash them in the wooden washer with a hand wringer attached. This, as you can imagine, would take up most of the day, plus hoping for a sunny, windy day to dry them all. The clotheslines ran east to west to catch the nice north breeze, but first the clotheslines all had to be washed and cleaned. The snapping sound of a clothesline of clothes greeted us as we came in for lunch from school. After this day's work, which didn't include keeping the fire going, there were 2 more meals to prepare. Breakfast was made and dishes done before the washing was started, and children to be cared for. Starch was made by boiling water and starch, and cotton shirts, dresses, and slips were dipped, wrung out, and hung on the lines. Late in the afternoon the time came to bring all these fresh-smelling clothes to be folded and the cotton clothes to be sprinkled for easier ironing. This was on the nice spring and summer days. In the winter the washing methods were the same, but the drying was far different. Frozen clothes were brought in from the line, dried on racks on indoor lines to thaw out and dry, and then sprinkled. Tuesday a lady started early to iron. A really good fire had to be going to heat the sad irons that were quite heavy and had 2 wooden handles that fit the irons. One had to hurry to get the handle on one of the irons over to the table padded with sheets and run the iron over a clump of beeswax, otherwise there'd be black spots from the stove. By the time you started to really iron, I think the iron was cool and you had to run to the stove for another iron, etc. All in all, it was a repeat of Monday, except Tuesday, bread making was added to the chores. Early in the morning the bread was made and set to rise behind the wood-burning heating stove in the dining room in a large metal bread pan where the bread rose, was kneaded 2 or 3 times, separated, put in loaf tins to rise again and be baked by supper time. There would be fragrant loaves of bread, warm from the oven, smothered in butter and honey, from the honeycomb honey in a little square containers. A Tuesday in spring might mean a visit from the fish peddler who came to the door selling fresh pickerel. Dad always said it was time for the mess of fish. The fish were delicious, dusted with flour and fried in a granite skillet in butter. We girls were all thin in spite of the large meals, as we walked nearly a mile to and from school 4 times a day. Dad had a large vegetable garden, and he sold strawberries to Cathcart's Red and White store, a family-owned business in Courtright, still there except it changed to a grocery variety store. The berries were plump and juicy all the way to the bottom of the boxes, no skimping there, and they sold for maybe 4 boxes for 50 cents. Red raspberries grew on bushes at the sides of the garden. Black currant and gooseberries were plentiful too. We also had corn, white beans, and lots of potatoes. New potatoes were small and were boiled maybe 6 at a time for lunch and would turn up next day warmed up in butter. The larger potatoes were gathered and put in bushel baskets in the cellar and lasted most of the winter. In the fall, alongside the ditches in the country were elderberry bushes and berries which Mother canned and made into lovely elderberry pies. There was jams and jellies made from the currants, gooseberries, strawberries, and raspberries, and from an excess of apples and apple jelly, boiled and strained through cheesecloth, poured into jars and topped with melted paraffin wax to seal them. Also in the fall was the lovely smell of green tomato chili sauce wafting through the house. As Dad owned a farm on the 4th line of Moore, now known as Highway 80, it was worked on shares, and we had lots of apples, spices for pies, and yellow, transparent apples, very good for eating, and later in the fall, delicious snow apples were kept in baskets in our cellar. Once in a while you see snow apples for sale, but I guess yellow transparent apples are a thing of the past. All these things were with the rows and rows of mason jars filled with food for the winter. Think of all the lifting of stove lids, putting wood in, and all fires to start and keep going for all the meals, canning, cooking, and baking. I believe Wednesday was a baking day. A room off our kitchen was called a pantry, a storeroom with shelves that held canned fruits. To save many trips up and down cellar stairs, a large crock of creamery butter sitting in water with an overturned plate with design that was pressed into the butter. Also in the storeroom were 100-pound bags of flour, costing about $2.86. I don't remember what 50 pounds of sugar cost. The flour went into the large flour bin topped by a bake board. From this bake board came fat, tasty sugar cookies with sugar sprinkled on top them before baking, ginger cookies sugar topped too, then rolled oatmeal cookies, and if they got a chance to cool, were filled with a date or apple jelly center. There was always somebody waiting for cookies hot from the oven, my dad especially. These cookies were made with rendered lard or bacon grease, thick sour milk, anything that was handy when the baking urge came on. And as we girls got older, we would ask how these baked goods were made, and Mother couldn't tell us apart from a dab of this or a dab of that and a pinch of something else. But they were tasty, as was everything else. Pie crust that melted in your mouth, apple pies for Dad, and butterscotch or chocolate for the rest of us. Today, by meringue whipped on a plate with a fork. Thursdays and Fridays were for cleaning the house carpets, and the floors were swept with a broom. The bristle end of the broom served another purpose. Covered by a clean cloth, it was used to clean the walls of stray spider webs and dust. The stove had to be cleaned and polished. Of course, cleaning the lamp chimney was a daily task. Mother was the oldest of the family of 9. of a family of 9. So every Sunday was like Christmas. They came from Bridgeton, Uncle Jim, Aunt Marion, and Joyce. A dear little baby, I sat and watched most of the day. Uncle Charlie, Aunt Rosie, and 2, 3, or 5 children, however many they had at the time. Uncle Oscar, a crabby bachelor. Aunt Lizzie, Uncle Bob, and their 4. Cousin Donald was like a tornado who broke all my buggies, bicycles, dolls, so it became a game of wits to get everything put away, dolls hung on the wall, when we heard the buggy being driven in the laneway, and Aunt Lizzie saying, "Hello, Maggie, how are you all?" Not from the south, just out of the back line, a few miles. Looking back, I guess we weren't used to boisterous boys. A lot of people sat around our huge dining room table, with 2 or sometimes 3 extra leaves put in, and enjoyed Mother's delicious meals. Every female member helped with the dishes, where the big bread pan came in handy, and after dishes came the entertainment. Uncles Jim and Charlie would play their violins, and Mother would join them at the piano. As Grandma Bidner lived with us, it was like old home week in the holidays. Aunt Diane, Uncle Carl, son Doug would come from Detroit, also Aunt Tina, Aunt Frances, Uncle Al, and Aunt Pearl. When it came time to do dishes, Aunt Pearl always came up with a headache and had to rest. One of my favorite aunts, but she just didn't like dishes. Later on, I tried the same headache routine, but somehow it didn't work for me. Saturday was baking day. Also to prepare for a company Sunday, but first there was the water to heat for the big wash tubs for Saturday night baths, and to get all of our clothes laid out for Sunday school. Also hair washed and done up in pieces of rags. Some days the hair looked like corkscrews, but we were spotlessly clean and fresh-looking Sunday morning, just a little neater than the other 6 days. Mother also cleaned and shone our patent leather shoes with Vaseline. They were worn Sunday, and when we got home they were put away again till next week. We each had Sunday clothes and play clothes. Sunday clothes came off every weekday, and our play clothes went on. I guess I would be pretty careful with clothes, too, if I had to go through all that wash procedure. Dad used to walk up the street to visit with cronies in front of Klinkman's garage, and later home he would come with a quart of ice cream. Walkerside ice cream was the best, 30 cents a quart. Louis May had an ice cream and candy store, and he would fill a little cardboard container with little metal carrying handles with vanilla ice cream, and long before we saw Dad, we could see the light of his cigar as he came back, and Mother would get out the saucers and spoons for our treat. There were some very nice memories. There was a store on the corner run by Bessie Cathcart, where we could buy most anything, the best thing being the large case of penny candy, where she waited patiently for all the kids on their way to school to make up their minds. Horehound sticks, chocolate-covered hard candies called honeymoons, BB bats, and day suckers. The kinds were endless. Winter time on the St. Clair River was wonderful. The river would freeze all the way across, and you learned to skate pushing a chair ahead of you, or you could walk across a distance of a little over a mile, do a little shopping, or go to. I will try to remember prices best I can. Bread, if you didn't bake your own, was $2.24 ounce loaves, 15 cents. Chicken and beef was 29 cents per pound. Lard, if bought, was 16 cents a pound. A dozen oranges, 29 cents. A jar of peanut butter, not homogenized, but with oil on top to be mixed, around 24 cents a large jar. Soap flakes were 45 cents for 2 large boxes. Considering the men had wages of $2 or $3 a day, those prices were quite enough. About the only entertainment was the AYPA meetings and dances, the dances being held at John James Hall, at which my sister Sarita and Georgina would play piano duets. Those were played between the acts of plays in the hall also. Georgina also played piano with the band. There were piano recitals given by Mrs. Dell, the only piano teacher at the time, and a good one, too. Mr. James, a teacher at the Presbyterian Church, also gave taffy pools in the winter. The ones that didn't get to dance recitals, etc., stayed home and listened to the Victrola wind-up variety, or a crystal radio set that ran on batteries. And when the batteries faded out, there went the evening's entertainment also. After we had hydro, of course, macaroni radio came in, and there were serials. Young Whiter Brown, Helen Trent, Argyle Sunday, to name a few, and they were mostly on during the noon hour, too. I think of all the work my mother used to do when I turn a dial for the washer, another one for the dryer, turn a knob on the gas stove, an oven comes to life, and all the other conveniences the wives and mothers have today. A show. The customs offer closed his eyes to anything under $2. $2 bought quite a lot of things. In the summer there was the ferry with a scow for carrying cans and customs officers at both sides. Courtright and St. Clair, there were people trying to smuggle goods back into Canada. In St. Clair, we would go to the St. Clair Inn to have a banana split. I think the banana splits would be 15 cents, complete with cherry on top. Single or double dip cones for 5 and 10 cents. Summer was a beautiful time, with all kinds of river traffic, steamboats, freighters, and passenger boats, North and South America, City of Toledo, Harmonic, Noronic, and Huronic, and the Tashmoo, a smaller boat that went as far as Detroit and back. There was no place quite so beautiful as the river. If you chose, you could step out your front door, cross the road, and down the river bank, where you could swim to your heart's content, and when the big boats went by, you would get the waves from them. There were 4 definite seasons then: spring, March to May; summer, June to August; fall, September to early November; and then came a long, cold winter with lots of snowdrifts, some as high as the fence posts. Dad also ran a beer sco with a dock far out into the river, where liquor was sold to boat trafficking. Only, too, sometimes the boats had printed destinations as far away as Cuba, but only unloaded at the next dock, which was really illegal, for a load of liquor would be pulled on cables under the river, as it was Prohibition days in the United States at this time. Dad slept with a gun under his pillow at all times, and there were speedboats blown up at our dock. Lots of scary things like that. Mother delicately called the beer scow a government export house. Most people referred to the scow owners dotted up and down the shores as rum runners. Those times passed, too. And that's the end of the story. So that's somebody's story from the 1930s. Alice Macrae. That was her story about their life in the 1930s. It was a lot different back then, wasn't it? They sure had it a lot harder than we do now. Take for granted the stuff that we have now, that people back then And they probably thought they had it good back then, even because their parents probably had it harder than they did. And this gets easier and easier for us generations, the new generations, it seems. A lot of good hard workers back then. You wouldn't have been able to survive unless you wasn't, I would say. So I hope you guys enjoyed going back to the 1930s with me tonight. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. Bye, guys. God bless.